In August 2006, a massive avalanche struck Russian climbers on K2. They were above the bottleneck at 8,350 meters when an enormous piece of frozen snow and ice hit them at high speed. 4 of them swept away by the avalanche and died. This is their story. The 2006 Kuzbass expedition was named after the expedition's mining sponsor. It featured an 8-member strong team. The purpose of the expedition was to climb K2 by the Abruzzi Spur route. Several other teams were on the mountain at that time. Everyone was fighting against strong winds, cloudy days, and short, unstable weather windows. Progress was slow, and it was difficult to establish camps and fix routes along the Abruzzi Spur. The Russians' team divided into small groups. In the first week of July, they made the first acclimatization on the mountain and reached a height of 6,050 meters, where Camp 1 was pitched. 2 tents were set up for the necessary amount of equipment and stuff that had been brought up. The team saw K2 clearly just once during the trek to base camp. Since then, the mountain had been in the clouds all the time. It was snowing every day, even in the base camp. There was a blizzard during the ascent to Camp 1. Camp 2 was established at an altitude of 6,700 meters. Warm temperatures followed the initial spell of poor weather. The ice started to melt, triggering rockfalls on the mountain. A rock the size of a horse head and weighing about 20 kilograms broke through one of the tents in Camp 1 and wiped it out. The tent couldn't be restored. Fortunately, there were 2 spare tents. They had to move Camp 1 to a safer place. On the 13th of July, it was snowing non-stop at base camp. The wind reached 150 kilometers per hour at 6,500 meters. Tents of other expeditions were swept up the southeast spur by a raging storm. During the second half of July, almost all the camps were destroyed. Despite the vicious weather, the Russians continued working on the route. They climbed up and down, rotating their small groups and retreating to base camp when required. Some teams abandoned their climbs, while others continued. A few climbers even summited despite the conditions. After a long spell of bad weather, the Russians had to move up. The first group on the 19th of July, in a hurricane wind, reached Camp 2 and found it in a deplorable state. Both tents were torn. The oars were broken. By some miracle, the wind didn't scatter their sleeping bags, dishes, and other things on the slopes of the mountain. Having securely consolidated what was left of their camp, they were forced to retreat. On the night of the 20th of July, both groups stayed together in Camp 1. The next day, the first group went down to base camp, and the second one remained waiting for the weather. On the 21st of July, the wind began to subside. The group went up to Camp 2 with a new tent and restored the camp. And on the 22nd, at an altitude of 7,350 meters, Camp 3 was established. Having spent the night at Camp 3, they went down to base camp on the 23rd of July. On the 23rd of July, the first group went to Camp 1 and joined by the second group the next day. On the 31st of July, a group of 4 climbers left advance base camp for the summit. The next day, the second group followed them. Due to the increased danger of rockfalls, they planned to move to Camp 2 at night and early in the morning. The climbing season was coming to an end. The base camp had significantly emptied. Jacek Taylor from Poland, Geir Tortlets from Georgia, and Terence Bennett of Northern Ireland joined the Russians on the summit push. On the 3rd of August, the first group reached Camp 3 and was supposed to go down the next day, as further upward movement was impossible due to snowfalls and heavy clouds. The second group decided to wait out the bad weather in Camp 2. Sergei Bogomolov joined them. Geir Tortlets abandoned his ascent and left for the base camp. The situation forced the Russians to move between advanced base camp and Camp 2 at night. In good weather, the stones would begin to fly early in the morning. They hoped for the weather to improve. They still had about 10 days. They were holding on and seemed to have moved to Camp 3 again in order to make a decision, still up or down. The 40 agreed that if the weather didn't improve, they would abandon their attempt on the 13th of August. But that day, the morning was bright and clear. Already on their summit push, the climbers decided to continue. Though some had left base camp 2 weeks earlier, the team remained strong. Despite deep snow on the mountain, the Russians made it to Camp 4 on the shoulder on the 12th of August. On the 13th of August, after waiting for many days for good weather in the upper camps, they decided to take advantage of the weather window and make another attempt to reach the summit. It had stormed for about 4 days previously, so they set up at 2 a.m. They went by 3 groups. Kolbachenko and Gafanov led the way, followed by a group composed of Alexander Voviet, Yuri Yutishov, Arkady Kovakin, and Fyodor Kuznetsov. A third small 40 of Bogomolov, Taylor, and Bennett followed. The groups kept some distance apart and reached the upper section of K2 on the 13th of August at about 1 p.m. They had managed to negotiate the treacherous Bottleneck and were very close to their goal. The summit was already clearly visible. 2 more hours of climbing and they would have reached the summit. They were inching up when suddenly, above the bottleneck at 8,350 meters, a huge, silent avalanche struck them at high speed. There were none of the usual sounds. It all happened almost silently. The avalanche swept the Russians away from a crest with the wild speed. Having fell downwards, it dragged up the climbers behind itself. But there were no usual characteristic sounds. Kolbachenko and Gafanov managed to dig themselves out, but the avalanche swept away the second party up the mountain. The third group miraculously survived. Unfortunately, the 4 guys who were at the front, their ropes snapped. Some of them went under the snow, and the other 2 were swept up about 400 meters down the cliff. Immediately after the incident, the survivors started to search for the 4 missing men. They could see traces of the avalanche as low as 7,800 meters. Bogomolov went 100 meters below the session route using the PAX ropes from a Japanese expedition, but without any luck. Kuznetsov, Kovakin, Voviet, and Yutishov had disappeared. On the 15th of August, Bennett, Jacek, and the 3 Russians climbers who survived the avalanche returned to base camp after a terrible, emotional, and physical descent from Camp 3. The tour operator company of the expedition wanted a helicopter search for the missing men. But the advantage of such operation wasn't great enough. Helicopter was capable to fly only up to 5,500 meters. Moreover, the weather after August 13 had deteriorated further, and then even the base camp was fogged, let alone higher altitudes. Authorities decided to declare the missing men as dead. Four years after the tragedy, some Kazakh climbers found a jacket, a backpack, and a camera on the glacier between base camp and advanced base camp. The belongings lay at the base of the kulva where the season route starts. They left the items on the glacier but took the flashcard from the Sony camera. Later in Almaty, they reviewed the photos. The camera had belonged to Kuznetsov. There were many images, right up to the hour before the accident. Some of the photos you see in this video are from that flashcard. In 2021, Ukrainian climber Valentin Saifeon found a jacket on the glacier, also sporting the Basque logo. In July 2024, an Italian photographer, Riccardo Salvatico, with an Italian-Pakistani expedition on K2, found the mummified remains of a climber during a glacier walk. Russian climber Yuri Krugolov, who was on K2, took a sample from the body to run a DNA test that will identify the deceased climber. In the meantime, the remains were buried beside the Gilki Memorial on the glacier. A photograph of the remains shows clothing from the Russian's brand Basque, founded in 1992. Basque explained in a letter that the logo style on the clothing only began in 2002. In time, DNA tests will identify the deceased climber. The current hypothesis is that the body belongs to Arkady Koakin. Doctors who made a visual examination of the corpse thought that the body belonged to a male climber aged between 17 and 30. Koakin was 32 in 2006. Jacek Taylor of Poland, who survived the avalanche, maintained that the clothes were definitely from one of the four Russians on the 2006 expeditions. He wrote that during the summit push, we were all in down jackets. Among the leading two climbers, one of them could have already taken off his outer down jacket or gone with it unbuttoned. It was probably one of them. Both of them had items with the Basque logo. In the 2006 climbing season, bad weather kept climbers from reaching the summit during June and July. A series of snowstorms made it impossible to climb K2. Only 4 climbers successfully climbed and descended K2 that year, 2 Italians and 2 young Japanese. They were the first to climb K2 since 2004. Warm weather on K2 that year prompted climbers to retreat under the threat of avalanches and rock falls. The only slight consolation for those poor unfortunate climbers was that they had managed to see its summit. Exactly 11 years ago, on the same date in 1995, a vicious storm on K2 had killed 6 climbers. They had summited dangerously late in the day on the 13th of August. They were making their way down from the summit when a murderous wind blowing at 100 miles per hour caught them. With no pack ropes to attach themselves to and nowhere to take shelter, they didn't stand a chance. The vicious storm literally blown them off the mountain, picked up one by one and flung them down the south face. Although a few hundred meters shorter than average, K2 is considered to be harder to climb due to the fact that it's steeper and rockier and subject to worse weather. Thank you all so much for watching.